intervention, because when someone realizes that, yes, I'm only having suicidal thoughts because probably it's just as a result of maybe depression, as a result of maybe my anxiety, as a result of maybe another kind of an underlying factor. And therefore, I only need to open up and maybe seek an intervention from an expert, or probably from a mental, from a health practitioner, a health institution. So we can be able to, if we foster this supportive environment, we can be able to save many lives, because suicide is preventable compared to the area narrative whereby maybe people feared that, when someone talks about suicide, and when they think about suicide, they have already made up their mind, and you can't stop them. I want to say that suicide is something that is, we can stop it, we can prevent deaths by suicide, and therefore we will be able to save so many lives, and prevent these kind of issues happening in the near future. So the change of narrative, as the theme states, in the year 2024-2026 is very, very, very vital, and it will help us to break down these barriers, provide resources. That is, the government will be able also to provide the resources. The communities will be able to come up with the resources whereby people are close to these the resources that can be able to help them, and we'll be able to also promote healing, and this will ultimately change this narrative that has been there to a better narrative and a positive narrative, and therefore reducing suicide rates and improving the overall well-being. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Arthur. And that is why we are here, to ensure we're having the right kind of conversation with the right information. So, of course, in the spirit of having conversation, maybe it's important for us to have an understanding of the different terms that we're talking about, because, we are saying there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of misconceptions, there's also a lot of stigma that comes when you're talking about anything relating to mental health. There's a lot of stigma. So maybe for George, you can now define for us what exactly is stigma, and how does it play a role, or rather, what role does it play when it comes to people reaching out for help in regards to their struggles with mental health, and in this case, with their struggles with suicide, or having suicidal thoughts or ideations.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think stigma is something that has been there for a very long time. And when someone mentions they have a specific mental health condition, and they're struggling either from depression or schizophrenia, which is one of the most common disorders that has been witnessed to be stigmatized, especially in our African context. Something that we as professionals, we have had to deal with in our day-to-day lives as we seek to work with patients. And stigma basically refers to the negative attitudes or beliefs, and they can also be behaviors that are associated with a particular condition. And in this case, we are talking about mental health. And this can go to the extent of one being stereotyped because of the symptoms that they are showing. And that's why we even have specific terms when we are referring to people who are struggling with mental health in our communities. And most of the time, when you confess you have a certain mental health condition, you may also experience some level of prejudice, which is the preconceived negative judgments about who you are. And this doesn't only affect the people who struggle with mental illness, but also their families as well. And the discrimination goes on and on. And unfortunately, one thing that I've been able to realize is that discrimination doesn't have any form of boundaries. And even in churches, you find if a certain family has a certain trait, or they have someone who has a mental health condition, they end up being ostracized in one way or another. And even on the topic today, when you're talking about suicide, when people lose a relative to suicide, some doctrines don't even allow the family to invite a priest or even a church leader to come and bury them, because in some doctrines it seems it is looked as if this person has done one of the most grievous of sins, so they cannot even officiate the burial. And that now begs the question, where are we going when it comes to stigma? And in our, unfortunately, we may assume that stigma doesn't exist in the religious settings, but everywhere, it's everywhere. And that is an example that I would like to give when it comes to stigma and how it affects different people who have different um, mental health conditions. And when you're talking about our specific conditions and whatever we're discussing today, suicide prevention, there are different things that perhaps can be really, really helpful when we are trying to look at different signs that can be able to portray if someone is either struggling with suicidal thoughts, or even when they're even stigmatized to the point where they cannot be able to communicate effectively. And one of the things that is very, very common when we talk about the suicidal signs or symptoms that we can look out for, one of them is verbal cues. Most of the time, we are social beings, and most of the time, we talk about different struggles that we have. And when you realize all of a sudden someone has decided to keep quiet, or maybe they are now even talking about suicide itself, because it can go either way. Either someone keeps quiet about an issue, especially when they are struggling with a problem, and most of the time, a family member will know that my brother or my sister is not okay, and all of a sudden they go quiet, then that is one major sign. Perhaps they've been able to think about a plan and they're now executing it, or maybe in the process of executing it. Same to verbal cues, when one now becomes overly talkative and they now verbalize suicide. And in addition to that, they may end up even verbalizing feelings of hopelessness and how they cannot be able to find a solution. That is also something that we need to look out for. And if I may relate this to stigma, when someone is pushed to the wall and they've been trying to get a solution and they've been able to seek help, and they may just decide to either verbalize suicidal thoughts or even go to the extent of now keeping quiet. And that sudden calmness is also something that we need to look out for. We have behavioral changes that will come along suicidal ideations or suicidal tendencies. And these can vary from one person to another depending on the environment. For someone who has been drinking, they may end up increasing the alcohol intake. And for other people who perhaps they were never using any form of drug, and all of a sudden they start using, that should be a question mark to the friends and the families who are around him. And that may show that perhaps they have been able to try everything that they were exposed to, and now drug is an option. And because drug never answers any question, there's a high likelihood that perhaps they may try to look for a permanent solution. And most of the time, people may think of suicide. Withdrawing from friends and family members is also one major sign that can really help us to identify if a relative is going through a challenge, especially when we have known them to be very, very interactive. So looking out at this particular behavioral sign where someone now all of a sudden withdraws, they are not talking anymore, and even gets to a point of giving out their properties, or even their belongings, their clothes, their car, or anything that they valued, and all of a sudden they're giving it away. That is something that will tell you this person is planning something that may not be really positive. Emotional changes are also very, very common. Feelings of emptiness and one experiencing intense anger or agitation or frustration. It can go either way, or even they can all come together at the same time. That is something that can really help us to identify when someone is suicidal. And lastly, I'd like to finish with risk-taking behaviors. Normally, as a human being, we have these tendencies to protect ourselves. That's why if someone tries to hit you, you react, you know, And if you're about to fall, you will try your best to protect yourself to ensure that you do not fall. But when we now begin to take risky behaviors and we don't even mind getting hurt or even losing our lives, as much as we may say or we may term it as being careless, that may also be a sign, especially for someone who has been verbalizing suicidal thoughts or has been showing suicidal tendencies. So that's something we need to look out for when someone all of a sudden becomes very risky or undertakes very risky behaviors. Thank you so much, Vivian.
Thank you so much, George, for the insight. So George has, informed us on what are some of the warning signs and symptoms of someone, of rather of a person either having showing suicidal tendencies as well as behavior. So it's important to, before we even get to address an issue, before you get to know how do I go about it, a good starting point is knowing, what exactly is it, how does it manifest, which is exactly what George was telling us about, or rather he was painting a picture for us. And then, then that tells us if then this is how a person behaves, then this is how I get to address it. But before we even get to address it, maybe Shalom, you can tell us what are some factors that, or rather, what are some risk factors that make a person susceptible to struggling with suicide? We were talking about, or rather, you mentioned earlier that suicide is a symptom of a larger problem. And in this case, it is always a symptom or a sign of a mental illness. So, what are these factors that put a person at risk with struggling with their mental health? And of course, in regards to our session for the day, what puts a person at risk with struggling with suicidal thoughts, as well as suicidal ideations or suicidal tendencies?
Thank you for that question. And I think this actually becomes a very learning, informative, and also a challenging session, because once we've identified the signs, sometimes it's good to also understand the risk factors that come. And as you said, suicidal ideations being a symptom of an illness, then I think the first thing I'd say as a risk factor is actually history of a mental illness or substance use illness. And part of the things, or rather the behavioral changes that George has just briefly mentioned would be, for example, with substance use, when there's tendency to increase the substance, tendency to just feel, and I think a term I've had before is I'm going to drink myself to death. And sometimes we just take it as a joke when actually it's a cry for help, whether direct or indirect, and that would just tell us there's an issue. Mental illness, we'd say of mental illnesses, maybe very common we've heard of, would be of depression. Now, suicidal ideations are a symptom of depression. And so if this person has had a change of behavior, the tendency to isolate themselves, in their verbalization of words, you've had them saying they're feeling hopeless, they're feeling worthless, life has no meaning anymore. They feel like everyone else is against them. And so what would be the need for them to leave? And of course, when they're brought in for an assessment within the hospital, you'd see that these symptoms have been existing for some time, possibly triggered by psychosocial factors, for example. But since they had not been talking about it, then we'd have it has passed, and the symptoms have been existing for a while. And so by the time they're getting to that point, they are very overwhelmed by the symptoms of depression, and now suicidal ideations have become a norm for them. And so we'd say one of the risk factors would be either substance and alcohol use or presence of a mental illness. Another risk factor I'd say would be previous attempts. If an individual has attempted suicide before, they've had these ideations before, probably with a plan or even without a plan, these thoughts may be dominant within their lives, and with every inconvenience or trigger would actually think or result to an attempt of suicide. And that would be another risk factor. And sometimes a sad fact fact that we've talked about in the clinical setting is someone who's attempted suicide before, even if we try to help, sometimes we are just postponing it. And that's a sad fact to just think about. And so that's why there's need for them to actually be under, individuals who've probably had ideations or attempted need to be under professional care, because even as family members, where we are limited, as loved ones, where we are limited to support them, it's good for them to actually have a professional who can be able to provide professional support for the times where the caregivers are overwhelmed. Another risk factor that I'd talk about would be undiagnosed mental health disorder, because most times, in one of the facts from World Health Organization states that prevalence, or rather the first time a mental illness may present itself is in teenagehood. And most times that fact also goes to state that it goes untreated or undiagnosed. And sometimes it's because maybe in teenagehood we'd excuse it for hormonal changes, we'd excuse it for what we call the psychosocial stages of growth, where this teen is just trying to understand themselves. This is a time where they're experimenting. And so over this time, we may take it as it's a behavioral thing. This person is just being deviant. This person is just being stubborn. This person is just, ever since that time, they've just gotten themselves into a lot of problems, and we do not know what it is. We just think it's them being deviant, but it actually could be an undiagnosed underlying mental disorder. And so that's why we keep insisting on the need for a professional, because then that way they can be able to identify the symptoms and do what we call psychoeducation, where now we can be able to understand as a society, to understand what this could be. And if it was just something that could be dealt with using just support like therapy, then they can be able to resolve this. And if it is something that needed medication, maybe, again, they can also be able to manage the symptoms. So that would be number 3. Another risk factor we'd say would be, in a big term, would be maybe the psychosocial stresses, where there's a lot of issues that someone would be an individual is going through. The times we're living in can be very tough. And so sometimes we may be going through challenges, and because we are lacking support, we are lacking that courage to even talk about the issues we are going through. Sometimes you're feeling limited, maybe financially, to even access these health services that we're talking about. And sometimes now we are having these feelings of hopelessness. There's no hope. Even if I wanted the help, I can't afford it. And you're just feeling very limited. And this is posing as a high stress for an individual, and in itself can put someone at the risk of actually feeling, you know what, maybe it's time, and they could actually result into attempting suicide. So stress would be part of it. That the presence of symptoms within symptoms of isolation, symptoms of hopelessness, could actually lead to just an individual feeling, maybe, I think this is it. I feel limited to deal with the situations anymore. There's another factor, a risk factor, where we talk about saying coming from a minority group while living in a hostile environment. Minority groups, sometimes we know, we'd say, the kind of support system we are having, because most of our, we'd say, values are shaped by the societies that we are living within. And sometimes the societies we are living within can be very hostile, very unaccommodative. There are things that are not acceptable as much as they are important. And sometimes that could be a challenge and could actually limit an individual on ways to deal with particular stresses, and will just lead them to feeling there's no one, the stigma maybe, or no one ready to help. And I don't think there's anything much I can do to help myself going forward. A last factor that I would mention is access to firearms. I know once, if I'd use an example, once we've seen, we've heard of our that key factor, I would say, that support system, we know the national police. Sometimes we've had this, that when these people are going through their challenges, and they have access to a firearm, even individuals we know who have access to a firearm, and they've contemplated either dying by suicide or taking out someone who has upset them. We've heard of that before. We've heard of those cases on TV. And so that access to a firearm, and they are having these ideations, can actually become a risk factor, because they know what to do. They have the weapon to use, and they can actually turn out to just use it against them. And then we'd have a case where someone ended up dying by suicide by possessing a firearm, which was supposed to be a protection, but now turned it against them. And I think that would summarize the major risk factors that we can always look out for or be aware of when it comes to suicidal attempts. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you so much, Shalom. So just to delve into a question in the chat box, Jadida asks, how would suicidal behavior look like in a teenager? Maybe we can have George answer the question, as he also maybe tells us why is it important to acknowledge and talk about suicide in a way that helps reduce the risk of it. Because as we said earlier, for every attempt of suicide, we are going to have many more attempts come up. So there's a notion we call the suicide contagion. So even in light of having conversation in this regard, so how do we ensure we are talking about it, or we are raising awareness in a way that it's going to help reduce the risk, as a result?
Thank you so much, Vivian, for those two questions. First of all, teenagers go through a lot, just like what Shalom has mentioned. And most of the time, we say that it's because of the hormonal changes that they experience in their day-to-day lives. But even the way we have been cultured in the African setting, and I'll use our setting because there's a way we have been cultured compared to other people from other continents. And for a teenager, it may portray differently compared to how an adult will view it. Number one, a teenager may not really have much control over what is happening around them. And most of the time, they may feel very, very helpless when it comes to the daily life that they have. So one of the things that they may experience is a lot of silence, especially if they've been exposed to environments where their voice have not been able to be, they have not been listened to by the people who are around them. And there's this notion, especially in our context, whereby children are not supposed to talk or even give feedback. So when all of a sudden they have become silent and they're no longer interested in expressing themselves, then that is one of the ways that teenagers may also show that they're experiencing some struggles when it comes to suicidal ideations. Other times is when they also verbalize it, and as much as you may think that they are being stubborn, and sometimes you may also assume that they're just being spoiled, it's very important for us to even take their comments very, very seriously. And when your teenager tells you that this is how they feel about a certain situation, and they're starting to have the thought of suicide, or even feel like life no longer has meaning, then that is something that we need to take a huge concern on. And one thing I've just remembered is humiliation as well. So teenagers do undergo a lot of humiliation depending on the stage they are in. And we've seen students and young pupils taking their lives because they did not perform well in a certain exam, especially the national exams. How do we handle it? And sometimes we may end up humiliating them in different ways. You are good for nothing. What is this you've brought home? So such things may also push them to suicide. And so when a teenager has been humiliated so many times, it may push them to the extent where they're now thinking of taking their own lives. And also normal things. I've just remembered of a story of a young girl who died by suicide after she was humiliated for having the monthly periods. And you can imagine that is a normal cycle that every young girl experiences, and of course, young lady. But for this young teenager, she was put to, or even exposed to an experience where she wasn't able to even understand why she's being discriminated or even humiliated for something that is very, very natural. So such things do put teenagers at risk. And the reason why the numbers actually tell us between the ages of 15 to 29, and I believe teenagers are more affected because they do not have the necessary coping mechanisms, and the emotions they have end up becoming their reality. So they end up experiencing more intense emotions, given that they're also undergoing some hormonal changes as they develop physically. Then that becomes a huge challenge for teenagers. And I'm hoping we can offer them a listening ear and not just assume they're being stubborn because they are in their adolescence period. And what this will do, especially if we do it well, we are going to bring up very, very confident young adults, boys and girls, who will be able to express themselves in a very confident manner. And at the same time, it will be a ripple effect, because how you're brought up, you end up learning the positive coping mechanisms, and you end up now teaching other people who are younger than you, and also your children in the future. And to the second question, when it comes to the importance of reducing the stigma and what we're talking about today, we have several things that we'll gain when we reduce stigma and the rate at which suicide is becoming very common, especially in our African setup. And talking about what we experience in our day-to-day struggles is one of the ways to positively reduce the stigma. And Arthur had mentioned about normalizing mental health talks and normalizing our struggles. That alone can go a long way in ensuring that we do not only assume that this is the normal part of life and we should just gather our strengths up and find solution. Sometimes we may not be able to find a solution there and then, and talking about it helps you to at least offload the pressure. And what that does, it reduces that level of stigma that is around us. And when we talk about such things, and you remember someone else talked about this, and the fact that we're also talking about it right now, it makes it easier for someone to communicate when they're not doing well, and for someone to even share some of the concerns they have. Another way that we can reduce the struggles and the stigma surrounding mental health and suicide is by acknowledging that we have daily struggles every day. And one of the things that I'm thinking about reducing some of the daily struggles may not entirely be at our own individual capability, but at a societal level. And by this, I mean going to the point of talking about the policies that we have in the country. And some of the issues that we struggle with each and every day come up because of the different mechanisms that have been placed by the government and the policies that we have. So if you're able to change some of these policies and the way we govern some systems in our country, then we'll go a long way in reducing this stigma and the suicidal rates that we have in the country. And because if you go to our own health system, if we talk about our education system, right now we have riots by university students who are basically pointing out the problem of the high fees that have been put in place and how many students may not be able to access university education because they cannot be able to afford. If you're able to change some of these things that we have, then we shall reduce some of the struggles we have in a very huge manner. Because if you talk to anyone, they'll tell you, I'm not able to raise my fee, I'm not able to make ends meet, I'm not able to provide for my family. And if you're able to tackle some of these matters from a policy point of view, then half of the problems you're talking about will be sorted out. So there are things we can do at an individual level, but also there are things that we can do at a societal level and at a policy level and governmental level. Thank you very much, Vivian, for the questions.
Thank you so much, George, for your response. So we have a question on the chat. Someone is asking whether social media plays a role when it comes to the mental health status of a teenager. And as we have Arthur answer that question, maybe he can tell us. So in line of, being better support systems, in line of being support networks for the people who are struggling, how can we be better support individuals, the people who have experienced, a loss of suicide? So that means, how do we support either people who know someone or who have a relative who has, died by suicide, or how do we support a person who is currently in their healing process, rather in their healing journey?
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry. Excuse me for that. Thank you so much, Vivian, for that question. And yeah, I think the person is asking whether social media plays a role when it comes to either suicide or the impact on mental or wellness. Definitely, we are a product of what we see and what we hear. And that means that anything that we consume has a particular impact on our mental well-being. That being said, there are so many things that can happen, probably, that kids and even adults can consume from the media, maybe the mainstreams of, the TV, or probably even other social platform, TikTok, name them, Instagram and what have you. And if at all they interact with materials that are quite harmful, or probably they are not very, very positive for their well-being, that generally means that definitely at the end of the day, this particular child will not be okay mentally. So I think even the televisions, they have that aspect of alerting us and guiding us as parents to always safeguard our kids. There is that, there are those programs that they will say this is for general public, general viewing, and there are others that they will say that they require parental guidance. So the key question will be, how often do we monitor what our kids are actually consuming? Are we exposing them to a lot of movies that contains these materials where people are exposed to suicide materials? And I know even when you look at Netflix, there will always be that tagline there on top telling you what is inside this particular movie. And at some point, they will actually indicate suicide and what have you. So it's always good to be keen enough and understand what is my child actually consuming, or even me as an adult. These things can happen so unconsciously that I'm just watching something, but then again, that kind of consumption at the end of the day will harm, will come back to me, and it will cause a negative impact on my side. The other key question that you have asked is quite very, very vital, and I don't want to keep repeating myself. I think the key elephant in this conversation, the elephant in the house, is actually stigma. And as George and Shalom actually put in it, is that we really need to be at a point whereby we are breaking the stigma. We are putting ourselves in the shoes of the other person, emphasizing empathy, and making sure that everything else will, we are supporting the person who is on the other side and who is experiencing these suicidal ideations, or even thinking about attempting. So how can we be of help to these particular people? The key thing here is to always ask them to talk with someone who can help. And the previous narrative was that if you ask someone whether they are thinking about suicide, you'll actually be planting an idea that you need to carry out or execute this particular kind of a thought. But that is not the true case. Is that the true case here is that asking someone whether they have any kind of thought about suicide, and even whether they have a plan, you are actually gathering information, and you're actually establishing a platform telling them that it's okay, these things happen. We actually have, sometimes we can have these particular thoughts. You don't need to worry about them. And this is just a thought, not every other thought in our mind should be executed. Not every other thought in our mind is actually the truth. So you are establishing such kind of a platform. So ask them, talk about them, let them express what they are telling you. Let them give give you a plan, like they have a plan, they have even a date. Let them give you everything that they have in their mind, and that kind of a conversation is you're actually promoting or giving them a safe environment whereby now are minimizing the stigma and they feel very, very safe to even share with you. Number two is to make sure that the language that we are using is positive language. We avoid the aspect of saying or talking or putting words that stigmatizes the other person. For example, maybe you avoid things like this person is a psycho, they're even thinking about killing themselves. This person is mad. This person environments which are positive, and by doing this, we make sure that our language is also very, very, very positive. This is just a human being who at some point they have this suicidal ideation. They are not suicidal. We don't call them suicidal people. No, we say this is other having suicidal ideation, but I don't turn to be a suicidal person. Don't define a person by their symptoms. Then make sure that you follow up. Make sure that if at all someone has actually opened up to you and they are telling you that they're thinking about taking their life by suicide, be there for them. You might not provide that kind of a professional help, but by being just there to listen, and they are talking and you're listening and you're guiding them and you're telling them, I know of someone maybe who can help. I know of a place whereby we can seek this kind of professional help. That is very, very, very important. And even after, maybe if this is your workmate, this is your colleague, making sure that when they come back, don't let them to be just alone. Sometimes we have that tendency whereby, and I think Shalom or George mentioned that these are people who probably are having an underlying condition, maybe depression. And sometimes when we're having depressive symptoms, one of it is actually to isolate. Sometimes I feel like being just alone. So when this person comes back to work or probably to your community, and you feel like you see and you witness that they are actually withdrawing and they just want to be alone, don't just allow them be like that. Go ask them, can I help? Can I do something? Just be there, open up, let them know that you're always there for them, and with that, it will actually help them so much. But the most important thing is to know that yes, someone has opened up that they have a suicidal ideation, that they have an attempt. Don't into professionals. We always say that suicidal ideation is a suicidal ideation, and even attempt is an emergency. Make sure that you link them with a professional, and that is why you should always have numbers, maybe even toll-free numbers, whereby you can connect them, you can give them, you can call and say that tell them that you're calling a professional who will be able to journey with them. And I think by doing that, we'll be able to change this narrative for good. Thank you so much, Vivian. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for your very elaborate answer, which answers the question on the chat on how can you advise or how can you show support for a person who is feeling suicidal or maybe wanting to cause harm to the people in proximity to them. So there has been a question on the chat, or rather a comment on the chat, that has encouraged us to maybe look at, the different categories of suicide as by one psychologist, or rather by one socialist called Emily Durkheim. So the basis of this theory of the different kinds of of suicide that there are is that there are different categories of suicide basically. So this particular sociologist categorizes them into first what we call egoistic suicide. So this one is basically when a person becomes socially isolated, especially a man. So, and they feel like they have no place in society. So that brings them to a point of wanting to die by suicide. So we also have altruistic suicide. So this one occurs in individuals or groups of people who happen to be too close or intimate. So especially maybe if they're going through times of difficulty, maybe if they're going through things such as war, or our environmental calamities. We also have anomic suicide. So this particular category of suicide, as the sociology says, is that is due to a certain breakdown of what is known as socially normal. So, for example, if maybe they have filed for bankruptcy, maybe they have lost their job, maybe they are trapped in debt and things like that, this is going to bring a person to a point of of suicide. And then we also have fatalistic suicide. So this particular one is due to an overregulation in society. So maybe if a person feels boxed, so for instance, people who have gone, when we're looking at histories of colonization, when you're looking at histories of slavery, you find that people such as slaves or servants were, would die by suicide because they feel very boxed, as if there's no way out. And this is just one framework of looking at, or rather of trying to explain exactly what suicide is. And one critique of this particular theory is that it tends to look at the environment as the causal factors of of a struggle with mental health. So it's not necessarily questioning the internal factors that could potentially be bringing about suicidal tendencies. So it's not factoring in mental health conditions. It's not factoring in the polygenic aspect of mental health status. When we talk about things like the brain chemistry that is going to affect a person's mental health, when we're looking at genetic history that is going to affect a person's mental health. So it tends to look at very one aspect of what will bring about suicidal ideations as well as tendencies. So as we wrap up, I would like to encourage us to, ensure we still are arming ourselves with the right knowledge. But in line of arming ourselves with the right knowledge, I would like to invite us for a second part of this particular webinar that will happen same time next week on Tuesday from 8:30 to 9:30, whereby, when we are talking about policy change, what are some of the things we are hoping to see? What are some of the policies we are hoping to make that are going to bring about awareness, that are going to, reduce the risk of stigma, that will, bar people or will make people shy away from reaching out for help, and still in line of being support networks. So what exactly can we do as individuals? What can we do as communities? What can we do as organizations or even as institutions in being in alignment of this particular theme of suicide awareness? It also means, as Arthur mentioned, ensuring how do we ensure we have the right information. When we talk about dying by suicide, or as opposed to, saying a person committed suicide, when we talk about the decriminalization of suicide as recently done by the Kenyan government, why is that important in ensuring that we are addressing the modalities of suicide awareness? So I would encourage us to join us for the second part of this meeting. So as we wrap up, maybe we can have Shalom give our closing remarks as I wish you all a lovely day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for all of us who've joined. Thank you for being part of the conversation and even for keeping it active in asking of questions and even allowing us to learn new information. And I think the only thing I just say, or rather as the theme for this year on today, 10th of September being the World Suicide Prevention Day, is that today we are trying to change the narrative on suicide, and the key factors would be we're changing as just Vivian just said, it's not committing suicide, we are decriminalizing suicide because we're understanding it's actually a symptom of an illness, and so we are changing the narrative by first decriminalizing it. By using the word they are attempting to die by suicide, and second, I'd say there's strategies that are being set in place because on community base, worldwide base, we are trying to change the narrative on suicide and creating this conversation so that people can actually be supported to first seek help before things get out of hand. And second, when it becomes too overwhelming, allowing us to be in a space where we can actually get professional help. And I'm looking forward to the conversation next week, where we can also create, rather continue learning better how to support and how to even identify these symptoms within ourselves before they get out of hand. So wishing us all a good mental health. And also, as you recognize this day, that remember your life is important and it is worth living. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shalom. I wish you all a lovely day. Looking forward to seeing us all next week, same time.